everyone, my name is Simerjit Simak, and today I'm going to review a book titled Snake Cradle, written by Roberta Sykes in 1997. It was her first installment in autobiographical trilogy. She was an Australian poet and author, Harvard PhD graduate. In fact, she was the first Black Australian to graduate with a doctorate. Born in 1943, for her entire life she campaigned for women, children, and indigenous land rights. For this book, she won National Biography Award and Kibble's Literary Award. I chose to read this book among the list because being a female and coming from a different culture, I have gone through some personal experiences, so thought somehow I could relate to Roberta Sykes. The book begins with narration of her childhood memoirs in detail. She was a dark-skinned girl born to a white mother and a father she did not know. She had to face a lot of racism and questionable behavior on a daily basis. It is hard to ignore the innocence of a child who wonders about the cause of things happening around her. She painted the life of Black Australians in last century and takes one to a journey of a free-spirited girl, considered to be unacceptable by society in those times. She was very ambitious child and wanted to study further, but expulsion from primary school at the age of 14 shook her back to the reality. She explains how she was called to principal one day and told to never come back. She never got the justification of this act, and it is understandable from the book that this practice of expelling dark skinned children after primary education was fairly common and accepted without much resistance. Throughout the book, she had an ongoing conflict to find her own identity, which was almost always turned down by her mother's refusal to give any information about her father. So she claimed herself to be Aboriginal by choosing snake as her totem, an emblem of courage with which she lived all her life. Post the release of her book, questions were raised about her Aboriginal identity, which I don't think have any significance because she suffered what most of the Aboriginal community suffered, so validity of her claims really does not matter. The book begins with her unbeatable zeal to follow her ambitions. She switched many roles, starting from a nursing assistant in Townsville General Hospital to a striptease dancer in Sydney. Because of her dark skin, she suffered as much as Aboriginal people did. A shocking and very painful narrated incident of gang rape at the age of 17 by a group of white boys on spree changed her life forever. She was subjected to violence so great that it's hard to put into words, but she still overcame. In spite of being a victim and not having committed any crime, she had numerous encounters with police. It is evident from the text that dark skinned people were looked down at very suspiciously and were not free to travel or use public transport. They needed to have a proof of document to show if they are free or not. After rape and assault, life was never the same for Roberta. She suffered from a lot of emotional and psychological issues, gave up on her dream to become a doctor, and she lost trust in everything around her. But ability of author to retain her dignity and fighting with odds to keep her head above waters is astounding. It's not just about growing up in Australia, it's a story of thousands of unspoken souls that had to go through similar ordeal and they're still bearing the consequences of our history. I think if we are genuinely interested in public health of Australia's first people, we need to be aware of this difficult history and how it is affecting us today. We should recognize that attitudes of many Aboriginal families to the mainstream health system has been shaped by the kind of experiences that Roberta had to go through in this book. And this is not only about healthcare system, its impact is much wider than that. When somebody is not accepted by society as equal, It gives a rise to a feeling of rejection, disappointment, and in extreme cases, even hatred. A key study in Victoria in 2010 and 11, funded by Lovica Institute, found out that those Aboriginal Victorians surveyed almost all reported experiencing racism in previous year. This included a range of behaviors from being called racist names, teased or hearing jokes or comments that stereotyped Aboriginal people, being sworn at, verbally abused, or subjected to offensive gestures because of their race. It's not a difficult concept to understand that racism causes psychological distress, depression, poor quality of life, substance misuse, and all of these things contribute significantly to overall ill health. In Australia, we are in denial mode and pride ourselves of being a multicultural nation where everybody gets a fair go. In today's times, we have some incidents of blatant display of racism in public transports, but mostly it has come to a more subtle form. That is on social media and other platforms, which show that there are still people who are uncomfortable with cultural diversity that we have. Discrimination causes a type of stress that disproportionately affects minorities. Aboriginal and Torres Island people are also dealing with the effects of past laws and government policies, which resulted in them being removed to missions and reserves, and they're taken away from their families. But now the question is what needs to be done? Racism is a complex phenomenon and it operates at multiple levels. Anti discrimination policies and laws are important to address the more blatant and obvious forms of it, but social media has a bigger role to play. Times have changed since Roberta wrote this book. Australia has a high rate of immigration, and it is not only about Indigenous people today, but our nation as a whole. Researchers have found that we are more accepting of migrants that come from countries with a long history of migration to Australia, such as Italy or Greece, and we tend to be more negative towards newer groups like migrants from Middle East and African countries. Negative stereotyping is fuels up prejudices against a community, which makes it really difficult for new arrivals to find jobs and housing and a lot of things. So in this book, Roberta Sykes not only goes through actually only goes through events of her life, and she does not give any recommendations on what should be done. So I would recommend this book highly to anyone who wants to know and understand events of the history, these events that we are not really proud of, but it will shock you, but somewhere will encourage you also to think deeply about the problems of those around us. I think everybody should read this book at least once. And if you think that racism and discrimination is a thing of past, then perhaps you can ask yourself, when was the last time you felt negative emotions against a group that you don't even know and with whom you have never had a conversation with, or have you ever avoided sitting next to someone in train? It's easy to blame others for our problems, and you might just think it's okay, but is it really okay? That's all for today. Thank you.